Evelyn Hale straightened the crooked portrait above the mantel for the 271st morning in a row, then froze, her hand still lifted when she heard the boots in the hall. Not her husband's tired stride, something worse. Nathaniel came through the door, white as bone, a sealed letter trembling in his fist. "Isabella," he said. "She's alive." And in that one breath, Evelyn understood the truth she'd swallowed for 9 months. She had never been his wife. She had been the thing he built to keep from breaking. Before we go on, if a story of love betrayal and a woman who refuses to shatter is the kind of story that stays with you, subscribe now and ride this all the way to the end. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, so I can see just how far this story travels tonight. She had learned the exact angle of that portrait, the way a woman learns a wound. 4 degrees. Always 4 degrees to the left by morning, as if the house itself leaned toward the woman in the painting during the night. Evelyn Hale had corrected it every single day since the wedding. Reached up, touched the gilt corner, nudged it level, and stepped back before anyone could see her do it. 9 months of mornings, 270 of them. She reckoned she could have straightened it in her sleep. The woman in the portrait had dark hair and a mouth that looked like it was about to say something cruel and charming at the same time. Isabella Hartwell, the dead one. Evelyn's fingers touched the frame this morning and stopped. Halfway. She didn't finish. She let it sit crooked 4 degrees toward the grave, and she stood there in her husband's grand summer parlor, listening to the July heat press against the windows, and she thought, let it lean. I am tired of holding up a dead woman's face. That was the moment the boots came down the hall. She knew every footfall in this house. She had made a study of them the way a stranger studies the sounds of a country not her own. Mrs. Abbott's heavy patient tread. Sally's quick little scurry. The stablemen who never came past the kitchen. And Nathaniel's measured weighted a man who walked like he was counting the cost of every step. These were his boots. But they were wrong. Too fast. Uneven. Evelyn. He was in the doorway. She turned, and what she saw stopped the breath in her chest. Nathaniel Hale was 32 years old and had a face that had never in the whole of their marriage given anything away for free. She'd married a man built out of restraint, all straight spine and shuttered eyes. A man who thanked God with the same tone he'd used to fire a clerk. She had come to think of that face as a locked room. The room was open now, and it was full of ruin. "What's happened?" she said. It wasn't a question. Questions were for people who still hoped. He held up a letter. His hand was shaking so hard, the wax seal caught the light. "Sit down." "I'll stand." "Evelyn?" "I'll stand, Nathaniel." Her voice came out flat and even, and she was proud of it distantly. The way you're proud of a fence still standing after a storm you don't remember surviving. "Say it." He came into the room. He was a big man, and grief made him bigger somehow, filled him up wrong. He set the letter on the little table between them, like it might go off. "It's from Charleston, from a man named Whitfield, a merchant I did business with his brother years back." He stopped. His jaw worked. "Evelyn, I need you to understand that I did not know. Whatever else I have done, I did not know this." "Know what?" "Isabella." He said the name and it broke in the middle. Isabella is alive. The fire she hadn't lit there was no fire. It was July. It was blazing summer, and yet she'd have sworn she heard a fire crackling. The whole world went quiet around that name. Alive. She waited to feel it land. She'd read once in one of her father's books before the creditors took them that a man could be shot and walk 10 steps before he knew he'd been hit. She stood there and waited to be hit. "You buried her," Evelyn said. "I buried a coffin. You wept for 2 years. You built this house around her memory. You hung her over the mantel." The words came out of her slow and clean, one nail at a time. "You told me the ship went down off the Carolinas. You told me there were no survivors. You told me—" She stopped because her voice had done something she didn't allow it to do, and she pulled it back down. "You told me a great many things, Nathaniel. They were true when I said them. Were they?" He crossed the last of the distance and reached for her hands, and she stepped back 1 step, clean, deliberate, and he stopped with his arms out and empty between them, like a man who'd reached for a rail that wasn't there. "Don't," she said. "Evelyn. You don't get to hold my hands while you tell me my marriage was a monument to somebody else." That struck him. She saw it strike him. His arms came down. "That is not what this is," he said low. "Then tell me what it is." She heard the door behind him, the softest sound, and knew without looking that Mrs. Abbott had come to the hall and gone still. The whole house holding its breath around the two of them. Let her hear. Let them all hear. "Tell me, Nathaniel, plain as you can, because I have spent 9 months being the most reasonable woman in Massachusetts, and I have run clean out of reason. What is this?" He picked up the letter again. His hands had steadied some the way a man's will when he has decided to walk into the fire on purpose. "She survived the wreck," he said. "She was taken aboard another vessel. A merchantman bound for the Indies, and then Charleston. She's been in Charleston. Whitfield knew her by a portrait his brother once painted. He wrote to be certain of the reward before he wrote to be sure of the truth." His mouth twisted. "There's always a reward, isn't there? There's always a man in Charleston who knows the price of a dead woman come back to life." 2 years, Evelyn said. "She has been alive 2 years, and you buried her one and married me the next and hung her over my head every night I have slept in your house. You slept in our house. Did I?" The silence between them had teeth now. Mrs. Abbott's voice came from the hall, gentle, terrified. "Mr. Hale, should I send for the doctor?" "Sir?" "Mrs. is awful pale." "Mrs. is fine, Mrs. Abbott," Evelyn said without turning. "Mrs. has never been finer. Bring coffee. My husband and I are going to have a long conversation, and I reckon he'll need his strength for it." A pause, then the tread retreating quick and grateful to be dismissed. Nathaniel stared at her. "How can you speak of coffee?" "Because if I don't speak of something small, I will speak of something large, and I don't trust what I'd say." She sat down at last. Not because her legs failed, she wouldn't give him that, but because she'd decided to, because sitting was a choice, and she was going to make every choice in this room from now on. She folded her hands in her lap. "Sit." He sat. "Now," she said. "You will tell me the whole of it, and you will not spare yourself because I'll know if you do. I have spent 9 months learning to read the things you don't say." His eyes came up to hers, and something in them she didn't have a name for. Surprise, maybe, or shame that had found the bottom and hit rock. "You knew," he said slowly. "This whole time, you knew you were, say the word, that you were living beside a ghost." "I dusted her," Evelyn said. "Every day. I straightened her over the fire. I served her guests in her dining room off her mother's china. I wore my own gowns because you never once offered me hers, which I took at the time for kindness, and now understand for what it was you couldn't bear to see another woman in her clothes." She let that sit. "I am not a fool, Nathaniel. I have never been a fool. I was only a woman with nowhere else to be." He flinched at that. Good. She wanted him to feel the shape of it. "When you married me," she said, "did you love me at all? And before you answer, I want the true thing, not the kind thing. I've had 9 months of kind things. They don't fill you up." The question hung there in the July heat. He was a long time answering. When he did, his voice had gone rough as gravel. "I married you because you were the only honest thing in a room full of people trying to marry their daughters to my land." He wasn't looking at her now. He was looking at his own hands. "Your father was ruined, and you came to that ball anyway, in a made-over gown, and every soul in the room knew it, and you carried yourself like a queen. And when I asked you to dance, you looked at me like you saw straight through the money to the man under it, and you weren't impressed by either one." A short, broken laugh. "You told me my house was too big for one man's grief. Do you remember?" "I remember. No one had said a true word to me in 2 years, and you said that." He shook his head. "I didn't marry you to replace her, Evelyn. I married you because you were the first person who made me want to be alive again. But I—" He stopped. "But you never stopped grieving her." "I never stopped grieving her." There it was, laid on the table between them, plain as the letter. She'd known it. She had known it in her marrow every morning she straightened that portrait. But knowing a thing and hearing a man say it out loud were two different countries, and she'd just crossed the border into the second one, and it was colder there than she'd imagined. "So I am a house you built while you were drowning," she said. "Somewhere to put your hands so you wouldn't sink." "That is not—" "It is exactly what it is. And now the tide's gone out, and there she is walking up out of the sea." He put his face in his hands. His shoulders, those broad, straight, restrained shoulders she'd watched carry the weight of half the county, without bending his shoulders, shook once. Just once. Then he mastered it the way he mastered everything, and she hated that he could, and she hated more that she understood exactly why he had to. "There's something else," he said into his hands. "There's a thing in the letter I haven't told you." Evelyn felt the floor tilt under her. "Of course there is." He lowered his hands. "She's coming here." "Here. Whitfield's already put her on a coach. He wrote after she'd left. She'll be at Ashford inside a week, maybe less." His eyes found hers desperate now, all the locks thrown open. "Evelyn, I did not send for her. I swear it before God I did not. She comes because it is her house too. In law, because we were engaged and there are papers. There is property tied up in her name that I never dissolved because there was no cause to dissolve the estate of a dead woman. Stop. And there's her family land in Charleston and the—" "Stop, Nathaniel." She was on her feet again, and she didn't remember rising. "You are telling me about papers. There is a woman coming to my door who owns the ground I stand on, who owns you, who owns the face over my fireplace, and you are telling me about deeds." She pressed her hand flat to her breastbone as if she could hold something in. "Do you hear yourself? Do you understand what it is you're saying to me? I am trying to tell you that I will protect you. I don't want protection. I want the truth, and you've been feeding it to me in spoonfuls since you walked in that door, and I am tired of being fed." Her voice cracked, and she let it this one time. 9 months, I straightened her picture. 9 months, I sat at the foot of a table set for a queen who was in her grave. And she was never in her grave, Nathaniel. She was in Charleston, wearing gowns, drinking wine, while I dusted her portrait and called this a marriage. The coffee came then. Sally, the little maid, edged in with the tray, and her eyes down, and her hands shaking the cups against the saucers, and Evelyn watched the girl set it on the table and thought distantly, "She's afraid of me. When did they all start being afraid of me?" And then, no. They're afraid of the house. The house has been holding its breath for a year, and now it's about to breathe. "Thank you, Sally," Evelyn said, and her voice was gentle again because it wasn't the girl's fault. None of it was the girl's fault. "That'll be all. Shut the door behind you." The door shut. They were alone with the coffee neither of them would drink. "Ask me," Nathaniel said quietly. "Ask you what?" "Whatever it is you can't stop turning over. I can see it going round behind your eyes. Ask me, and I'll answer true. I owe you every true answer I have left." Evelyn looked at him a long moment, and she found to her surprise that the thing turning over behind her eyes was not the biggest question, not the loudest one. It was a small one, a splinter of a thing. "When she comes," Evelyn said, "when she walks through that door alive, will you look at her the way you look at that painting when you think I'm not in the room?" She'd never told him she'd seen it. All those evenings, him standing at the mantel with a glass gone warm in his hand, gazing up at the dead woman with a face he never once turned toward his living wife. She'd catalogued each one. She'd told herself it was grief, and that grief was allowed, and that she could be patient, that patience was a kind of love a body could survive on. His silence was the answer. It went on too long. It went on into the place where a no should have lived, and no no came. "That's what I thought," Evelyn said. And something in her that had been standing upright for 9 straight months, some inner beam, some load-bearing wall settled and cracked, and did not fall, but changed the way a house changes, when you finally admit the foundation's wrong, and there'll be no living in it the same way again. She sat back down. She poured the coffee. 2 cups. Steady hands, she'd make sure her hands were steady if it killed her. She slid one across to him. "Drink that," she said. "You look like death, and I'd rather not have 2 of you rising from the grave this week." A sound came out of him that was half a sob and half a laugh. The sound of a man who has been braced for a war and been handed instead a cup of coffee and a wife who would not weep in front of him. "Evelyn," he said. "Evelyn, how are you? How am I sitting here?" She lifted her own cup. Her wedding ring caught the light. She looked at it as if it belonged to a stranger. "Because I have been getting ready for this morning without knowing it since the day I said yes to you. Some part of me always knew she'd come back. A woman like that doesn't stay dead. Women like that are too well loved to die quietly." She sipped. "Bitter. Sally's let it steep too long. Damn the coffee." "I won't. The coffee is the only honest thing in this room. It's exactly what it says it is." She set the cup down with a small click. "Now, you said you'd answer true. So here is what I need from you, Nathaniel Hale, and I need it plain." He leaned forward. For the first time all morning, he looked at her fully at her, not through her toward some absent thing, and she felt the weight of that gaze and refused to let it warm her because she'd been warmed by that gaze before, and it had cost her everything and given her a portrait to dust. "Anything," he said. "When she stood at your side and you were promised and you thought she'd live to be your wife." Evelyn kept her voice level. "Was I ever going to exist in the whole span of your life, in the whole plan of it, was there a single day in which Evelyn Carter was ever meant to be anything at all?" "No," he said. The honesty of it went through her like a blade, clean, almost merciful in how fast it cut. "No," he said again, gentler, seeing what it did. "You were never in the plan. You were the thing that happened when the plan died. And I have spent 9 months being ashamed of that, being ashamed that I found something in the wreckage I never went looking for, because it felt like a betrayal of her to want it." His hands closed around the coffee cup, and she watched his knuckles whiten. "And now she's alive, and I look at you, and I don't. Evelyn, I don't know how to grieve a woman who's walking back toward my door, and I don't know how to hold on to a woman who's already halfway out of mine, and I am not a man who does not know things. I have never in my life not known what to do." "Well," Evelyn said, "that makes 2 of us knowing exactly what we don't know. It's a start." She rose. She smoothed her skirts, and she walked deliberately to the mantel, and she reached up, and she took hold of the portrait of Isabella Hartwell, and she lifted it clean off its hook. Nathaniel came half out of his chair. "What are you—" "She's coming home," Evelyn said. "She'll want her face back." She turned it around so the woman looked at the wall. "And I find I no longer wish to look at it. I've looked at it enough for 1 lifetime. 2 lifetimes, if we're counting hers." She set it down against the wall, face in, and where it had hung, there was a clean, bright rectangle on the plaster, unfaded, the shape of a ghost that had finally been lifted off the wall. They both looked at the empty space. 9 months. Evelyn said softly, "I straighten that picture every morning. 4 degrees. It always leaned 4 degrees toward, I used to think, toward the window. I know now it leaned toward you. Toward wherever you were sitting. Even the paint knew who it belonged to." She turned to face him. "I won't be straightening it anymore." Nathaniel stood in the middle of his own grand room like a man in a house that had turned foreign overnight. "Evelyn, what are you telling me?" And here it was, the moment she'd been walking toward since the boots came down the hall, since the wedding, maybe since the ruined ball in her made-over gown. She felt strangely calm now she'd reached it. The way you feel, she reckoned, when you've stopped falling and finally hit the ground and found to your surprise you're still breathing. "I'm telling you, I don't know yet," she said. "That's the true thing, and you asked for true things. I don't know if I'll stay or go. I don't know if there's a marriage here to save, or only a grave I've been keeping tidy. I don't know if you can love a living woman as hard as you loved a dead one, and I don't know if I'd want to be loved by a man who only learned how because I stood in for somebody else." She crossed to him. She stood closer than she had in weeks. Close enough to see the exhaustion cut into his face, the 2 years of grief, and the 9 months of pretending laid one on top of the other, like sediment in a riverbank. "But I'll tell you what I do know, Nathaniel Hale. Her voice dropped low and steady and certain. I know I am not a replacement. Not hers, not anyone's. I was born the only one of me there'll ever be, and I forgot that for 9 months in this fine house full of a dead woman's things, and I am done forgetting it. She lifted her chin. So when she walks through that door, and she will in a week maybe less, she'll find 2 women in this house. And she'll learn quick that I am not the one who's easy to bury. The July heat pressed against the windows. Somewhere in the house, Mrs. Abbott moved through her duties and Sally clattered something in the kitchen, and the great estate of Ashford went on breathing around the ruin in its parlor. Nathaniel looked at his wife, truly, his wife standing there with her chin up and her hands steady, and the empty rectangle on the wall behind her, where a dead woman used to reign, and for the first time in the whole of their marriage, Evelyn Hale watched him look at her, like she was the only living soul in the room. She turned away before it could reach her. Finish your coffee, she said. You'll want your strength. And she walked out of the parlor with her back straight and her steps even past Mrs. Abbott in the hall, who dropped her eyes up the wide stairs of the house that had never been hers, and she did not let herself cry until the bedroom door was shut and bolted, and there was no one left in all the world to see that Evelyn Carter, who had married a grieving man and become a monument, was still underneath the marble, a woman with a beating heart. Downstairs, the portrait of Isabella Hartwell faced the wall. And somewhere south of the Carolinas, on a rattling coach eating up the miles between Charleston and Massachusetts, a woman the whole world thought was dead, sat with her gloved hands folded in her lap, watching the summer country roll past the window, coming home to a house she still believed was hers, and to a man she had no idea had learned in her absence how to love somebody else. The week did not last a week. It lasted 4 days, and Evelyn counted every one of them the way a condemned woman counts the boards on the gallows steps. She rose before the household on the first of those mornings and found Nathaniel already awake, already dressed, standing in the hall outside a bedroom door that had stayed bolted all night. He didn't ask her to unbolt it. He'd learned that much at least. He only said, I've had the east room aired, for Isabella. It's the farthest from ours. How considerate, Evelyn said, pinning her hair without a mirror without slowing. You've put your dead love 3 doors down instead of 2. I'm sure that'll comfort me at breakfast. Evelyn. Do you want a medal, Nathaniel? She turned and looked at him. You've spent 9 months arranging a house around 1 woman. Now you're arranging it around 2. It's what you do. You arrange. You manage. You move us about like furniture and call it protection. His jaw tightened. That isn't fair. No, she agreed. It isn't. Very little about this week is going to be fair, and I've made peace with that. Have you? He didn't answer, and she walked past him down the stairs, and that was the first morning. The second morning, the letters started. Not from Isabella. From everyone else. Evelyn came down to find 3 of them on the salver by the door, and Mrs. Abbott hovering with the particular stillness of a woman who has already read the return addresses and knows what they mean. Evelyn slit the first one open, standing right there in the hall. Mrs. Prendergast, the banker's wife, the woman who ran half the drawing rooms in the county and all of the gossip. Dearest Mrs. Hale. Evelyn read aloud, her voice bone dry. What a season of astonishments. We hear the most extraordinary things and hardly know what to credit. Do say we may call on Thursday, one does so long, to offer comfort in a trying time. She lowered the paper. Comfort. She'd sooner offer me a knife and ask which rib I'd like it in. You needn't receive them, ma'am, Mrs. Abbott said quietly. Oh, I'll receive them. Evelyn folded the letter along its crease, precise as a blade. If I hide, they'll say I've been beaten. If I sit in my parlor and pour their tea with a steady hand while the whole county watches to see if I'll shatter, then they'll go home with nothing to chew on but their own disappointment. She handed the letter back. Send word I'm at home Thursday. And Mrs. Abbott the good china, not the everyday. If they've come to watch a hanging, they'll drink from the best cups I own. Something moved in the old woman's face. It might have been the start of a smile. Yes, ma'am. That was the second morning, and Evelyn thought she understood the shape of the thing now. She thought it was a battle to be fought in drawing rooms with tea and steady hands and a chin held level. She was wrong. The real thing hadn't started yet. It started on the third morning, and it started at the breakfast table, and it started with Nathaniel's brother. Evelyn had not known Nathaniel had a brother present in the county. She'd known one existed, Charles Hale, younger, spoken of the way you speak of a debt you've decided to stop paying. But she'd never met him. He'd been in Baltimore, she'd been told, on business that was always described in the vaguest possible terms. He was at the table when she came down, sitting in Nathaniel's chair, which was the first thing she noticed, and eating Nathaniel's eggs off Isabella's china, which was the second, and looking at her over the rim of a coffee cup, with an expression she disliked on sight. "You'll be the wife," Charles Hale said. "I'll be Mrs. Hale," Evelyn said, and took her own seat, and did not ask where her husband was, because she'd be damned before she'd let this stranger see her not know. "Mrs. Hale." He set the cup down. He was younger than Nathaniel, and softer, somehow handsomer, in a way that hadn't cost him anything, the way of a man who'd never once had to carry the weight his brother carried. "You know, I wondered what sort of woman marries into a grief that deep. I confess I expected someone more decorative. And I expected someone more useful than a man who eats another man's breakfast in another man's chair. We're both disappointed. Pass the bread." He laughed, delighted, and passed the bread, and that should have warned her. A man like that only laughs when he thinks he's already won. "You've heard she's coming, then," he said. "The whole county's heard. Mrs. Prendergast is bringing tea and vultures on Thursday." He buttered nothing, ate nothing, only watched her. "And has my brother explained to you what her coming means, in law, I mean? Has he sat you down and gone through it deed by deed?" Evelyn's hand did not pause on the bread. She'd have sworn to that later. Her hand did not pause. But something cold walked up the back of her neck. "My husband and I have discussed the estate." "Discussed?" Charles smiled. "That's a lovely word for it. Did he discuss the fact that the marriage settlement, the one that gives you your widow's portion, the roof over your head, should God take him? Did he happen to discuss that it was drawn up against an estate he does not entirely own?" The bread was in her hand. She set it down on her plate unbuttered, and folded her hands, and looked at her husband's brother with the flat calm she'd spent 9 months learning. "Say what you came to say, Mr. Hale. You've clearly rehearsed it on the whole road up from Baltimore." Ashford was never all Nathaniel's. Charles leaned in, and the softness in his face had gone somewhere, and underneath it was something harder and hungrier. Half of it came through the Hartwell family, through Isabella. It was to be joined in the marriage, her family's land and ours made one, and my brother the master of all of it. That's why he mourned her the way he did. Oh, he loved her, I don't doubt he loved her. But a man doesn't build a shrine to a woman for 2 years over love alone. He built it over what died with her, the whole of it, slipped through his fingers when the ship went down. "You're telling me," Evelyn said slowly, "that half of Ashford is Isabella's." "I'm telling you it was to be Nathaniel's through Isabella, and it never was because she died before the vows. Which means it never joined. Which means it's still hers." He spread his hands. "And she's not dead. So she's coming to collect. And the marriage settlement my dear brother signed with you, the one you're counting on, is written against land he can't guarantee. When she takes back what's hers, your portion isn't worth the paper it's inked on." The dining room was very quiet. "And you know this how?" Evelyn said. Charles's smile came back wider. "Because I'm named in the old papers, too. The Hale portion, if the Hartwell match failed, was to fall in part to me. My brother's been keeping me out of my own inheritance for 2 years by pretending the whole estate was his to grieve over." He sat back. "Her coming back doesn't just cost you, Mrs. Hale. It cracks this whole family open like an egg, and I intend to be standing there with a spoon." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked her bread back up and buttered it slow and even, and took a bite and chewed it and swallowed, while Charles Hale watched her and waited for her to break. "You've made one mistake," she said at last. "Have I?" You came to me thinking I'd married your brother for the roof and the widow's portion and the fine china." She nodded at the plate under his idle hand. "You came to frighten a decorative woman off her comfortable settlement, so you'd have one less mouth at the table when the estate gets carved. But I didn't marry Nathaniel Hale for a roof, Mr. Hale. I married a ruined merchant's daughter's chance at a life, which is to say I married knowing full well that everything can go to nothing in a single afternoon. I've watched creditors carry my father's books out the door one crate at a time." She took another bite, swallowed. "You cannot frighten a woman with the loss of a thing she never trusted she'd keep. You'll have to try something else." The delight left his face entirely then. What was underneath it wasn't hungry anymore. It was ugly. "We'll see how brave you are," Charles said, rising, "when she's standing in this room and my brother has to choose which woman's name goes on the deed." He tossed his napkin on the plate. "Enjoy your bread, Mrs. Hale." He left. Evelyn sat alone at the long table with the good bread going dry in her mouth, and found that her hands had begun very slightly to shake, and she pressed them flat against the table until they stopped because she'd promised herself steady hands, and a promise was a promise, even when there was no one left in the room to keep it for. She found Nathaniel in the study an hour later. She didn't knock. "Your brother's here." Nathaniel looked up from a spread of papers, and the look on his face told her everything before he opened his mouth. "I know. He came to me first. I sent him to breakfast to be rid of him." He stood. "Evelyn, whatever he said, is it true?" She crossed to the desk. "The land, half of Ashford. Isabella's family, the settlement written against ground. You can't guarantee is it true. He didn't lie. She'd give him that always to the end of her days. In the great things he never once lied to her face. It's more complicated than he made it sound. But the bones of it—" He stopped. "The bones of it are true, yes." Evelyn put her hand on the edge of the desk. Not to steady herself. To have something solid under her palm, while the last of the ground she thought she stood on went soft. "So I married you," she said, "and I don't even own the widow's portion I thought I owned. If you die and she's alive, I could be turned out of this house by a dead woman with a better claim than mine. That will not happen. You keep saying things won't happen." Her voice climbed and she hauled it back down because Charles Hale might still be within earshot, and she'd be damned if she'd give him the satisfaction. "You said she was dead. You said the ship went down. You said I'd be provided for. Every solid thing you've handed me has turned to smoke in my hand, Nathaniel, and now you're standing there in your study with your deeds and your papers telling me that will not happen. How? How will it not happen? Show me the paper that says so. Show me one single piece of paper in this whole grieving house that tells me the truth." He came around the desk. He didn't reach for her this time. He'd learned that too. He just stood close, and his voice when it came was low and rough and terribly tired. "I have been in this study every night this week," he said, "until the candles burned to nothing. Drawing up a new settlement. Signing over to you, free and clear the part of Ashford that is beyond question, mine the house, the Northfields, the mill. Land no Hartwell claim can touch. So that whatever happens, whatever she wants, whatever Charles schemes, you cannot be turned out. You cannot be left with nothing. I have been trying to build you a floor you can stand on, that no one can pull away." Evelyn stared at him. "That's what you've been doing," she said slowly. "The candles. I saw the light under the door. I thought—" She stopped. "You thought I was writing to her." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. "Evelyn." He said her name like it cost him. "I have not written a single word to that woman. I would not know what to write. Everything I have done in this house since that letter came, I have done for you. Badly. Silently. In the wrong order and without telling you. Because that is the only way I have ever known how to protect anything quietly with papers in the dark, so no one has to be frightened. And I understand now that it's exactly the thing that's breaking us. That you would rather I told you the house was burning than woke to find I'd quietly put out the fire while you slept." He shook his head. "But I don't know how to be the other kind of man. I've never once had to be." And there it was. The thing she'd been missing, the piece that turned him from a villain into something far worse and far harder to leave a man who loved her in the only broken language he had. She should have softened. Part of her wanted to. But she'd softened before, and she'd woken up a monument. "Show me the settlement," she said. He blinked. "It isn't finished. The lawyer comes Friday. Show me what you've got. Tonight. All of it. Every paper, every deed, every clause your brother thinks he can use against us." She stepped closer, and now it was her turn to hold his gaze and not let go. No more quiet, no more dark. "If we're going to fight a dead woman and your brother and the whole county for the ground under this house, then I'm going to know exactly what ground there is. You want to protect me, Nathaniel? Then hand me a weapon and get out of my way. I'm a better shot than you think." Something changed in his face. It wasn't relief, and it wasn't quite hope. It was closer to the look a man gives another man he's just realized he underestimated. "Tonight," he said. "All of it. All of it." That was the third morning, and by the end of it, Evelyn understood at last what she'd walked into. Not a battle in drawing rooms. Not a matter of tea and steady hands. A war for the very floor beneath her feet, with three fronts: the woman coming up from Charleston, the brother sitting at her breakfast table, and the husband who loved her in a language that kept nearly killing her. She had thought she was preparing for a rival. She was preparing for a siege. They worked until the candles burned down, just as he had, but this time on the same side of the desk. She read faster than he expected. She'd kept her father's books before the ruin, she said so flatly when he raised his brows at how quickly she found the flaw in the second deed, and she read a contract the way other women read a face hunting for the thing it was trying not to say. "Here." She stopped, finger on a line near midnight. "This clause. The Hartwell portion reverts to Isabella in the event the intended marriage does not occur. Does not occur. That's the word. Not in the event of her death. It never contemplated her death at all. It only ever cared whether the wedding happened." "Which it did not," Nathaniel said heavily. "So it reverts." "No." Evelyn's eyes came up bright and hard. "Read it again. In the event the intended marriage does not occur." "Whose marriage, Nathaniel?" "It says, the intended marriage. Yours to her. And that marriage didn't fail to occur because of a broken engagement or a change of heart. It failed to occur because she was declared dead. By a court. There's a death certificate. You have it. You buried a coffin on the strength of it." She sat back. "Legally, in the eyes of the state of Massachusetts, Isabella Hartwell died 2 years ago. That certificate is a document, and a woman who has been legally declared dead does not simply walk back into her property because she's turned up breathing. She has to go to a court and undo her own death first, and to do that, she has to explain where she's been." Nathaniel finished slowly, and Evelyn watched the understanding land on him like the first light of a morning he hadn't believed would come. She has to swear under oath how a woman lost at sea came to be alive in Charleston for 2 years and never once wrote home. She has to explain the European nobleman, Evelyn said quietly. The one your Mr. Whitfield's letter didn't quite come out and name, but hinted at plain enough that even I caught it. She didn't survive a wreck and get carried helpless to Charleston, Nathaniel. A helpless woman writes home. A woman who's been living 2 years in a port city under a false death chose it. She has to stand up in a court and say why. The candle guttered between them. "She can't afford to," Nathaniel said. "The scandal alone. The scandal is her whole leverage and her whole ruin both at once." Evelyn agreed. "She can threaten you with coming back from the dead, but the second she makes it official, the second she goes to a judge to claim the land she has to explain the dead part, and that story will end her in every drawing room from here to Charleston." She closed the deed. "Your brother didn't know this. He was so busy counting what he'd inherit if the family cracked open that he never asked the one question that matters: can she even open it? And the answer is, she can't. Not without burning herself down to do it." Nathaniel was quiet a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had changed. You found in one night what 3 lawyers missed in a week. Your lawyers were looking for a way to protect the estate, Evelyn said. I was looking for a way to protect myself. Turns out it's the same door. I just came at it needing it more. She rose, gathering the papers into a neat stack, squaring the edges. Which means when she arrives, we already know the one thing she's praying we don't, that her threat is a bluff. She can hurt us with words and whispers. But she cannot take this house. Not without destroying herself to do it. Then why is she coming? Evelyn paused with the papers in her hands. That, she said, is the only question left that matters. And I mean to have the answer out of her before she has her cloak off. She set the stack precisely in the center of the desk. Because a woman doesn't ride 200 miles to claim something she can't take. She rides 200 miles for something else. And until I know what it is, I don't know what she's willing to burn to get it, including me. She left him there, with the guttered candle and the squared papers, and went up to the bedroom. And this time, she did not bolt the door. She left it unbolted, not as an invitation, as a message. I am not hiding from you anymore. When she comes, we stand on the same floor, or you can go stand on hers. He did not come up, but in the morning she found he'd slept in the study chair upright so as not to presume, and something in the sheer bull-headed gentleness of it, put a crack in the wall around her heart that she spent the whole 4th day trying and failing to plaster back over. Isabella Hartwell arrived on the 4th day at 4 in the afternoon, and she did not come the way the dead come back. She came the way a queen comes home. Evelyn heard the coach before she saw it, and made herself finish the letter she was writing to a lawyer of her own. One Nathaniel didn't know she'd found because she'd decided somewhere in the small hours that she would never again stand on ground only one man could vouch for. She signed her name, blotted it. Only then did she rise and go to the hall where Nathaniel already stood, and Charles already stood, and Mrs. Abbott and Sally and half the household had found reasons to be near the front of the house all at once. The door opened, and Evelyn understood in the space of a single breath exactly what she was up against. Isabella was beautiful, the way weather is beautiful, the kind you admire, right up until it takes the roof off your house. She came in out of the summer light in traveling clothes finer than anything at Ashford, and she stopped just inside the door, and she looked around the hall slowly at the faces at the walls at the wide staircase with the soft, wondering expression of a woman come home from the dead to weep with joy. It was a performance. Evelyn knew it in her bones the way she'd known the coffee was oversteeped. Every catch of the breath, every tremble of the gloved hand rising to the mouth, every glistening welling of the eyes. It was beautiful, and it was practiced, and it was aimed straight at Nathaniel like a rifle. Nathaniel! Isabella breathed, and the whole hall leaned in. I didn't dare believe I'd see this door again, and Nathaniel Evelyn watched him. She made herself watch every second of it. Nathaniel stood very still. His face did the thing it always did, the shuddering, the locking. But his eyes went to Isabella, and they stayed, and something crossed them, old and deep and terrible, and Evelyn felt it land in her chest like a stone dropped down a well. He hadn't lied. He'd said he didn't know how he'd look at her, and here was the not knowing playing out in front of the entire household. Then, Nathaniel's gaze broke from Isabella's. Deliberately she saw it cost him, saw the muscle in his jaw work with the effort and came to rest on Evelyn instead. And he crossed the hall, past his brother, past the staircase, past the woman he'd mourned for 2 years standing there with her arms half lifted for an embrace that didn't come. He crossed the whole width of the hall and stopped beside his wife and took her hand in front of all of them, in front of Isabella, in front of Charles, whose face went sour as milk, and he laced his fingers through Evelyn's and held on. Isabella, he said. His voice was steady. Welcome. This is my wife, Mrs. Evelyn Hale. The word wife hung in the air. Isabella's welling eyes stopped welling. For just an instant, half a heartbeat, no more, the performance slipped. And underneath it, Evelyn saw the real thing, quick and cold and calculating, taking in the joined hands, recalculating, adjusting the plan. Then the softness flooded back over it like a tide coming in over a rock. "Your wife." Isabella smiled, and it was radiant, and it was murder. "Of course. How wonderful. I'd heard but one hardly credits a new mistress of Ashford." She came forward, both gloved hands out now reaching for Evelyn's free one. "My dear, you must think me a ghost come to haunt you. I promise I'm quite flesh and blood. And I'm so grateful truly that Nathaniel found someone to keep him company in his grief. It must have been such a comfort to him, standing in all this time. Standing in. There it was, laid down soft as a card on a table, sweet as poison in tea, so gentle that no one but Evelyn and the woman who'd said it would ever know it for the blade it was. "You are the substitute. Everyone in this room knows it. I have only come to reclaim the original." The hall waited. Nathaniel's hand tightened around Evelyn's. She felt him gathering himself to answer, to defend her, to manage it, and she squeezed his fingers once hard. A signal that meant no. "This one is mine," and felt him understand, and go still. Evelyn took Isabella's offered hands in both of hers. She held them warmly. She smiled, and hers was every bit as radiant and every bit as much a weapon. And she'd learned it, she realized, from watching this woman's own portrait for 9 straight months. "Miss Hartwell." Evelyn's voice was gentle as summer rain. "What a journey you've had. 2 whole years and such a long road home. You must be exhausted down to your bones carrying a secret that heavy all that way, all alone." She let it sit just long enough. Watched the flicker cross Isabella's face there, then gone, but there. "We've put you in the East Room. It's the quietest in the house. I thought you'd want somewhere you could rest and think and decide very carefully what it is you've come all this way to say. Because I do so want to help you say it right. The truth can be such a delicate thing to word after so long practicing something else." The 2 women stood joined hand to hand in the middle of the hall, smiling at each other, radiant warm, and between them passed a current of pure understanding that not one other soul in that house could read. "I know," Evelyn's smile said. "I know you chose it. I know about the nobleman. I know you cannot take this house without burning yourself to ash, and I know you know I know. So, now we begin." And Isabella's smile holding said back, "Clever girl. But you have no idea yet what I've truly come for. And when you find out, that steady little hand of yours is going to shake after all." "You're too kind," Isabella said aloud. "I'm exactly as kind as the situation calls for." Evelyn answered and released her hands and turned to Mrs. Abbott. "Show Miss Hartwell up, the East Room. And Mrs. Abbott?" She smiled at the housekeeper. "The everyday china for supper tonight, I think. We're family now, no need to stand on ceremony." She heard Charles make a small choked sound of pure frustration somewhere behind her and paid it no mind. She walked back toward her writing desk with her husband's hand still in hers, and her spine straight, and her steps even past the empty bright rectangle on the parlor wall, where a dead woman's face used to hang. And she did not look back at the living one, now climbing the stairs, because she had already seen everything she needed to see. And what she had seen was this. Isabella Hartwell had not come home for the land. Evelyn had been right about that. The land was a story she couldn't afford to tell in a courtroom. She had come home for the man. And the man was standing there holding his wife's hand like it was the last solid thing in a flooding world, looking not at the woman he had grieved for 2 years, but at the one he had married by accident, and was only now far too late and far too clumsily learning how to love. Which meant the war Evelyn had prepared to fight over deeds and courtrooms was not the war at all. The war was going to be fought over Nathaniel Hale's heart, in his own house, at his own table. Every single day with tea and soft words and radiant smiles, until one of the 2 women in Ashford Estate broke, and Evelyn Hale, ruined merchant's daughter monument, turned mistress, climbed the stairs that evening to dress for the first supper of that war, and caught her own reflection in the dark window at the landing, and saw a woman she almost recognized looking back. Chin-level eyes, clear hands, at long last, perfectly still. "Not the one who's easy to bury," she told the woman in the glass, and she went down to supper. Supper was a battlefield laid with silver. Isabella came down in gray, morning gray, and Evelyn caught the choice at once, the sheer nerve of it. A woman come back from the dead, dressed as though she were the one who'd lost someone, sitting at another woman's table, in the color of grief. It was a masterstroke, and Evelyn admired it, the way a soldier admires the accuracy of the shot that just missed her head. "I hope you'll forgive the gray," Isabella murmured as she took her seat. The seat Charles pulled out for her. Evelyn noticed before the footman could. "I find I'm still in mourning. For the years, I suppose. For everything one loses at sea." "Of course," Evelyn said, and signaled for the soup. "Grieve as long as you need. I've learned this house has a great deal of patience for grief. It's practically the foundation." Nathaniel's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. Charles smiled into his wine. And so it began. Evelyn had thought she knew the shape of the fight after that first afternoon in the hall. She was wrong about that too, because what Isabella did over the following days was not attack. It was worse. It was remember. She remembered everything. She remembered that Nathaniel took his coffee black and bitter and asked for it that way at breakfast the second morning before Evelyn, who had learned it herself only over months, could say a word. She remembered that he hated the sound of a clock ticking in a room where he was working and drifted into the study on the third afternoon to still the mantel clock with one gloved finger, and Nathaniel looked up startled, and something old and easy passed over his face before he could stop it. She remembered the name of the horse he'd ridden as a boy, and the way his mother had died, and the joke he'd made at some ball a lifetime ago that had made her laugh so hard she'd spilled her punch, and she told these things at the table warmly to the whole company, as though she were only reminiscing, only filling the silence, when what she was truly doing was laying claim memory by memory to a man in front of his own wife. "This is how well I knew him," each story said. "This is the depth of the water you're standing in. You've had 9 months. I have the whole of his youth." And Evelyn sat through it and smiled and passed the bread. But it cost her. God, it cost her. Each remembered thing was a small stone laid on her chest, and by the third night she lay awake counting them, the way she'd once counted mornings, straightening the portrait. And she thought, she's going to win this by attrition. She's going to remember me right out of my own marriage, one anecdote at a time, and I'll have nothing to answer with because I don't have his youth. I only have his mornings, and she's taking those too. It was Sally who gave her the first thread to pull. The little maid came in to do the fire on the fourth cold morning for July, a gray one, and lingered twisting her apron until Evelyn set down her pen and said, "Out with it, Sally. You've been circling me like a cat all week." "Ma'am?" Sally's voice dropped to a whisper. "It's Miss Hartwell. Her letters." Evelyn went very still. "What letters?" "She has me post them. Every day, ma'am, 1 or 2. To Charleston. I don't read, ma'am, not proper, but I know my letters enough to make out the direction, and it's the same name every time. A man's name." She swallowed. "And she pays me a coin each, not to mention it to the master. Only it didn't sit right, ma'am. I mean a woman writing a man in secret and paying to hide it, and you being so kind about the china and all." "What name, Sally?" "Delacroix, ma'am. I sounded it out. Mr. Delacroix, in Charleston." Evelyn sat back slowly. The nobleman. The one Whitfield's letter had hinted at and never named. Not a memory. Not a wreck she'd been carried from. A man she was still writing to daily from inside Evelyn's own house in secret, while she dressed in mourning gray, and remembered Nathaniel's boyhood horse at the supper table. "Sally," Evelyn said quietly, "the next letter she gives you to post. You'll bring it to me first. You won't open it. I'll not ask you to do a wrong thing. You'll only let me see the outside of it, the direction and the seal, and then you'll post it just as she asked, and you'll say nothing, and you'll keep her coins. You've earned them twice over now." She reached out and pressed the girl's twisting hands still. "You did right to tell me. You did braver than half the county. Now go do the fire, and let your face forget everything it knows." Sally nodded wide-eyed and did the fire and left. And Evelyn sat alone with the first real weapon she'd been handed since the boots came down the hall, a name and a lie, and a woman writing love letters to a man in Charleston while she laid siege to a husband in Massachusetts. She hasn't come home for Nathaniel after all, Evelyn thought, and felt the ground shift again. Or not only for him. She's still tied to Delacroix. So what is this? What is she doing here remembering my husband's coffee if her heart's still posting itself to Charleston every morning? She didn't have the answer yet, but she had the thread. And Evelyn Carter, who'd read her father's ledgers by candlelight and found the theft that ruined him 3 days before the creditors did, Evelyn Carter knew how to pull a thread. She pulled the first one at breakfast gently in front of everyone. "Miss Hartwell," she said, buttering bread. "I've been meaning to ask. Charleston, you were there the whole time, 2 years in one city. It must have felt like home by the end." She looked up, warm, curious. "Did you make many friends there?" "One does, I think, in a place one's stranded. People who look after you." The smallest pause. "A few," Isabella said. "One is grateful for kindness among strangers. Of course. Anyone who helped you home, we ought to write and thank them. Nathaniel would want to. Wouldn't you, Nathaniel, thank the people who kept her safe all that time?" "I would," Nathaniel said, and meant it, and looked at Isabella with such open gratitude that Evelyn nearly lost her nerve. "Then you must give us all their names," Evelyn said sweetly, "so we can thank them properly, every single one. It's the least this house can do." Isabella's smile held, but her hand reaching for her cup stopped for just a breath in the air, and Evelyn saw it, and Isabella saw her see it, and across the breakfast table, the two women looked at each other and both understood that the game had just moved to a new square. "How thoughtful," Isabella said. "I'll make a list." "Do," said Evelyn. "I'll help you remember." Charles, who missed the whole exchange because he was buttering his own bread and dreaming of deeds, said, "Speaking of remembering Nathaniel, when's the lawyer coming? Friday, was it? We ought to have the papers out, get everything settled while Isabella's here to sign what needs signing." The table went cold. "Nothing needs signing," Nathaniel said. "Half this estate's Hartwell land, brother. She's alive. It reverts. You know it, I know it. And Mrs. Hale here?" He nodded at Evelyn without looking at her. "Had best know it too before she gets too comfortable ordering the china." "Charles." Nathaniel's voice dropped into a register Evelyn had never heard from him, flat and quiet and dangerous. "You will not speak of my wife's comfort at my table again." "Or what? Or you'll take your dreaming and your Baltimore debts, and you'll do it under some other man's roof." Nathaniel set down his knife. "I know why you came, Charles. You didn't come for family. You came because you heard a dead woman was walking, and you thought the whole estate would crack open and you'd get your share of the pieces. Well, it won't crack. I've seen to it." "Seen to it how?" Charles's face had gone red. "You can't seen to it a Hartwell claim. The land reverts to her on her. On her what, Charles?" Evelyn set down her own bread. Her voice was pleasant. It landed like a slap. "Do go on. The land reverts to Miss Hartwell on her reclaiming it. And how does a woman reclaim land she can only inherit by first being alive? When the state of Massachusetts has her down on paper as 2 years dead." Silence. "There's a death certificate." Evelyn went on, still pleasant, still buttering nothing, now her hands perfectly still. "Signed by a judge. Nathaniel has it in that study. Before Miss Hartwell can touch 1 acre of Hartwell land, she has to go before a court and undo her own death, swear out under oath in public record exactly how she came to be alive in Charleston for 2 years without once writing home." She let it breathe. "It's a simple thing, really. A morning's work for a lawyer. All she has to do is stand up in front of a judge and tell the whole story. Every friend, every kindness among strangers." She looked directly at Isabella. "Every name." Isabella's face did not move. That was the tell. A woman with nothing to hide flinches, protests, laughs. A woman with everything to hide goes smooth as marble, and Isabella had gone smooth as marble. Charles looked from Evelyn to Isabella and back, and Evelyn watched the arithmetic finally start behind his eyes, the sum he'd never bothered to work. "Is that, Isabella? Is that true? You have to go to court. You have to—" His mouth opened. "You can't, can you? You can't tell that story. What in God's name is the story? Charles," Isabella said, cool as still water. No, no, I've ridden all the way from Baltimore on this. If you can't claim the land, then there's nothing to crack. There's nothing for me you've dragged me into. Charles. Nathaniel's voice low. What were you even doing for 2 years that you'd rather leave a fortune in the ground than stand up and say it? Charles! Isabella's voice cracked across the table like a whip, and for one instant, one single unguarded instant, the morning gray widow was gone, and what sat in her place was hard and cold and furious. A woman who had built a plan brick by careful brick and just watched a fool put his boot through the wall of it. You were told to be patient. The word told hung in the air. Told. By whom? By Isabella. Which meant Charles hadn't ridden up from Baltimore on his own scent of a cracking estate at all. He'd been sent for. Evelyn felt the whole shape of the thing lurch and reassemble in her mind, and it was so much larger and so much worse than she'd guessed that she had to set her hands flat in her lap to keep them still. You wrote to him? Evelyn said slowly into the ringing silence. Before you ever came here. You wrote to Charles in Baltimore and brought him up to Massachusetts to press the claim to stand there at breakfast and frighten me off my settlement and rattle the estate so hard that Nathaniel would have to bring the lawyers and open the papers. She looked at Isabella with something almost like wonder. You couldn't go to court yourself. You knew that from the start. So you needed him to force the estate open from the inside on your behalf as a Hale, so you'd never have to stand up and explain the dead part. He was your battering ram, and he didn't even know it. Charles had gone white. That's exactly it, Nathaniel said quietly, and Evelyn heard the grief in it, the real grief, the deepest yet, not for Isabella returned, but for Isabella revealed. He was looking at the woman he'd mourned for 2 years, as though seeing her truly, seeing her for the very first time. That's exactly it, isn't it, Isabella? You didn't come home. You came to collect. And when you found me married, you didn't leave. You just changed the plan. Kept the tears. Kept the gray. Started remembering my horse and my coffee at supper to work on me while Charles worked on the papers. His jaw worked. How much of it was ever real? Any of it? The girl I put in the ground, was she ever the girl I thought I was burying? The table held its breath, and Isabella cornered exposed her battering ram broken and her secret letters one loose made away from the light, did the only thing left to a woman that clever. She stopped pretending. She sat back in her chair and she let the morning gray softness drain right out of her face, and what was left was something Evelyn had glimpsed in flashes all week, and now saw whole, intelligent, exhausted, and utterly without illusion. You want to know if it was real, Isabella said, and her voice had changed entirely. No more catch, no more tremble, just flat, clean truth at last. Here's real, Nathaniel. I did love you, once, when I was 21, and you were the finest thing in the county, and I thought love was enough to build a life on. She laughed short and bitter. And then my father lost everything quietly, the way your Charles is losing everything now, gambling and speculating in the dark, and there wasn't going to be any Hartwell land to join to any Hale land. Only debt, only ruin, only a wedding, where I'd have come to you with empty hands and a bankrupt name. She looked at him steadily. You'd have married me anyway. I know that. That was the worst of it. You'd have married me and spent your whole life paying my father's creditors and never once thrown it in my face, and I'd have watched you get smaller and poorer loving me, and I could not. I would not do that to either of us. So you died, Evelyn said softly. So I died. Isabella turned to her, and there was no venom in it now, only a strange, terrible kinship. The ship truly went down. That part was real. I was truly aboard, and it truly sank, and I truly should have drowned. And Delacroix's vessel truly pulled me out of the water. And somewhere on that deck, cold and half-dead and free for the first time in my life of a name that had become a death sentence, I made a choice. She met Nathaniel's eyes. I let Isabella Hartwell drown. I let you bury her. Because a dead Isabella owed no one anything. A dead Isabella couldn't ruin the man she loved by marrying him. It was the only gift I had left to give you, Nathaniel, my absence. And you took it, and you grieved it, and then... Her gaze flicked to Evelyn. Then you went and did the one thing I never planned for. You recovered. The whole room understood it at once. You didn't come back for the man, Evelyn breathed. And you didn't come back for the land. You came back because you'd heard he'd married. You came back because the great noble sacrifice you'd made dying, so he could go free, you found out he'd taken that freedom and given it to somebody else, and you could not bear it. Isabella's face was the answer. I gave up my whole life for him, she said very low, and for the first time all week there was something raw and real bleeding through. I drowned myself for him. And I come home to find he laid my ghost down in 9 months and put another woman at my table, and he looks at her the way he never once. She stopped, pressed her lips together. I told myself I came for the land. It was cleaner. It gave Charles something to want and me something to hide behind. But you're right, Mrs. Hale. You've been right about everything since the moment I walked in that door. She almost smiled. I came home to see if it had meant anything. My death. If he'd carry it forever the way I've carried mine. And instead, I found you'd healed him. She shook her head slowly. I didn't come to take your husband. I came to find out whether the man I sold my whole life for was worth what I paid. And the answer, it turns out, is that he was worth every cent for you. Not for me. Nobody moved. Delacroix. The letters, none of it was a lover. Evelyn understood now with a lurch of pure vertigo. Or not only a lover. She was still tied to him, still bound to the vessel, and the man who'd pulled her from the sea, still writing to Charleston every dawn, because she had a whole other life there, a real one. One she'd built in the 2 years of being dead, and she'd left it to ride 200 miles north on nothing but a wound. The letters to Delacroix, Evelyn said, and watched Isabella's head come up sharply. Yes, I know about those. You've been writing him daily since you arrived, paying my maid to hide it. She held Isabella's gaze. You have a life in Charleston. A whole life. A man waiting on it. You don't want Nathaniel, you'd have to give up everything you built to have him, and you already gave up everything once, and I don't think you've got another sacrifice like that left in you. So what are you doing here, Isabella? You've had your answer. He loved you enough to grieve you and heal anyway. What's left to stay for? And here Isabella went quiet in a way that frightened Evelyn far more than any of her performances had. Because, she said slowly, Delacroix isn't waiting on me out of love, Mrs. Hale. He's waiting on me out of debt. My debt. She folded her gloved hands. I didn't survive 2 years in Charleston on kindness among strangers. I survived on his money. And a man like Delacroix doesn't spend 2 years keeping a drowned woman in silk out of charity. He kept me because I promised him the one thing I still had a claim to. Her eyes lifted and went deliberately around the great dining room, the walls, the silver, the wide staircase beyond the door. Ashford? Evelyn said. The bottom dropped out of her stomach. He didn't send me home to see if Nathaniel still loved me, Isabella said. That was my reason, mine and mine alone. And I'll not apologize for it. But it isn't why he let me go. She looked at Nathaniel now, and there was something almost like an apology in it, and something like a warning. Delacroix holds my debt, 2 years of it, and I signed when I was cold and half-drowned and desperate, I signed him a claim against whatever I might one day recover of the Hartwell estate. He let me come north to press it. Charles was meant to force the papers open. And once the Hartwell land reverted to me, she drew a slow breath. It wouldn't have stayed mine an hour. It would have gone to Delacroix in Charleston the moment the ink dried. He's not a nobleman, Nathaniel. That was my dressing. He's a creditor, and he is coming. Coming, Nathaniel repeated. He's grown tired of letters. Isabella's composure finally fully cracked, and what showed underneath was not calculation, and not grief, but plain animal fear. I've been writing him every day to hold him off, to swear the claim was moving, that Charles was close, that the land was nearly free. But he stopped believing me. His last letter said he'd waited long enough. She looked around the table at the 3 faces staring at her. He's on the road north. He may be a day behind me, 2 at the most, and he is not a patient man, and he is not a kind one, and he does not care in the slightest that there's a court or a certificate or a wife or a brother. Her voice dropped to almost nothing. "He's coming to collect a debt on this house, and I have led him straight to your door." The clock Isabella had stilled 3 days ago began somewhere in the recesses of the house to tick again. Someone had wound it, and in the ringing silence of that dining room, every soul at the table heard it counting off the hours until a stranger arrived from Charleston to take everything. Evelyn stood. She did not shake. She had promised herself steady hands, and she kept the promise now when it mattered most. And she looked around the table at Charles Gray, and unmanned, his scheme collapsed under him. At Isabella, unmasked at last, a frightened woman who'd sold her death and now couldn't buy it back. At Nathaniel, her husband, looking at her the way a drowning man looks at a shore. "Then we have a day," Evelyn said. "Perhaps 2. And I do not intend to spend it grieving or scheming or writing secret letters to Charleston." She set her palms flat on the table. "Isabella, you're going to tell me everything. The debt, the amount, the paper you signed, every word of it tonight in the study with a candle and a pen, because a claim built in the dark can be broken in the light, and I have broken one before. Charles, you wanted to be standing here with a spoon when this family cracked open. Well, it's cracking. So make yourself useful, or get off my road, but you will not sit in my house and eat my bread and work against me 1 more hour." She turned last to Nathaniel. "And you," she said, "you have spent 2 years protecting a dead woman's memory and 9 months protecting me in the dark, without ever once letting me stand in the light beside you. That ends tonight. There is a man coming to take this house, and he does not care which of us he ruins first. So we stop being 2 women and a husband and a brother, all guarding our own separate wounds." Her voice rang out clear and hard in the still room. "We are the people who live at Ashford, all of us, and a stranger is riding north to take it. I say he finds the door barred and every soul inside it standing on the same floor for once." She lifted her chin. "Now, who's with me?" And in the silence that followed, it was Isabella Hartwell, dead 2 years unmasked, 10 minutes and more alone in that moment than she had been at the bottom of the sea, who rose slowly from her chair and looked at the woman who had every reason on earth to throw her out into the road, and said in a voice stripped clean at last of every performance she owned, "I am." They worked through the night, the 4 of them, in the study, where the candles had burned down so many times that week. It was a strange council. Evelyn at the desk with the deeds and a fresh sheet of paper. Nathaniel beside her, close, no longer managing from the shadows, but working under the same lamp. Charles slumped in the corner chair, unmanned and useful for once, dredging up from his Baltimore years everything he knew about men like Delacroix, how they moved, what they feared, which threats were real, and which were show. And Isabella across the desk, telling the truth at last, one hard piece at a time, while a woman she'd tried to unseat wrote it all down. "How much?" Evelyn said. "The whole of the debt, every dollar. Don't soften it," Isabella told her. Charles let out a low whistle from the corner. Nathaniel went still. "That's more than the Northfields and the mill together," Nathaniel said quietly. "It's more than Ashford," Isabella said. "That's the point. That's always been the point. Delacroix never wanted the money paid back. He wanted a debt so large it could only ever be settled in land. He kept me in silk for 2 years and let the interest run because he was never buying my company." She looked at the desk. "He was buying an estate, mine if I could recover it, yours if he had to take it in payment." Her voice dropped. "I understood it too late. By the time I saw the trap for what it was, I was already dead to the world and alive only on his ledger. There was no going to the law. A drowned woman can't file a complaint. I'd erased myself so thoroughly that I'd erased every protection I might have had." She met Evelyn's eyes. "You spoke of your father's creditors carrying his books out 1 crate at a time. I have spent 2 years being one of those crates, waiting to be carried out." And Evelyn, who had every reason to hate this woman who had straightened her portrait for 9 months and served guests off her mother's china and been called a replacement to her face in her own front hall. Evelyn felt the hatred she'd been carrying shift and set down some of its weight. Not all, but some. "You should have written home," she said, not to Nathaniel, To a lawyer, to anyone, the day you understood the trap. I know that now. Isabella's composure held, but barely. I was too proud, and then too ashamed. And then it was too late, and a person can live a surprisingly long time in too late. You learn to make a home in it. Well, Evelyn dipped her pen. You're out of it now, whether you like it or not. Because the trap he built has one flaw, and you've just handed it to me, and I don't intend to let either of us go back to being a crate. Nathaniel turned. What flaw? Evelyn kept writing as she spoke fast now, the pen scratching. Delacroix's whole claim rests on one thing. The paper Isabella signed in Charleston, the claim against whatever she might recover of the Hartwell estate. Wow. She looked up. But she can't recover it. We established that at supper. She's legally dead, and to undie, she'd have to stand in a Massachusetts court and confess the whole thing, which would sink her and expose him. So Delacroix's own leverage is worthless in law. The second he tries to enforce that paper, he has to prove Isabella's alive, which means he has to bring her back from the dead in front of a judge. And he can't do that without the whole story coming out. His story. A creditor who hid a shipwreck survivor for 2 years to fatten a debt against another man's land. She set the pen down. He isn't coming here because his claim is strong. He's coming here because his claim is air, and the only place air like that has any weight is in a dark room with a frightened woman and no witnesses. He's not coming to file suit. He's coming to frighten. To stand in this hall and make it all feel true and inevitable and legal, so that Nathaniel pays him to go away before anyone thinks to ask for the paper in the daylight. The room was silent. It's the same thing you did, Evelyn said to Isabella not unkindly. Exactly the same. You came to frighten me off my settlement because you couldn't take it in a court. He's coming to frighten Nathaniel off the estate because he can't take it in a court either. You learned it from him, or he from you. It hardly matters. It's the family trade, this collecting in the dark on debts that wouldn't survive the light. Charles gave a hollow laugh from the corner. You're describing half the men I owe money to in Baltimore. I'm describing your whole life, Charles, Nathaniel said without turning, but there was less iron in it now, and more weariness. Which is why you're going to help fix this one. So you remember when the next dark room finds you that a debt only has the power you agree to give it. Charles said nothing, but he sat up a little straighter. So we don't pay him, Nathaniel said, turning back to Evelyn. We don't frighten. We meet him in the light. We meet him in the light, Evelyn agreed. With witnesses, with the death certificate on the table. With a lawyer of our own, mine's already written, he can be here by morning. I sent for him the day she arrived, because I decided a long while ago never again to stand on ground only one man could vouch for. She caught Nathaniel's flicker of surprise and held his gaze. Yes, I've had my own lawyer coming since the first afternoon. I love you, Nathaniel. God help me. I've worked out somewhere this week that I do, but I stopped waiting to be protected. I protect myself now, and I'll protect you too, and that's the shape of it going forward, or there's no going forward at all. I love you. It fell into the room almost by accident in the middle of a battle plan, and it landed harder for it. Nathaniel opened his mouth, closed it, reached across the desk and put his hand over hers, over the pen and the paper, and the whole ruined tangle of it. Say the rest of the plan, he said roughly, before I say something that stops us working. Evelyn's throat was tight. She said the rest of the plan. Delacroix arrived the next afternoon, and he arrived the way such men always do, as though the house were already his, and he'd only come to inspect it. Evelyn watched from the window as the coach came up the drive. She'd expected something theatrical. What stepped down was worse, an ordinary man. Well-dressed, unhurried, pleasant-faced, the sort of man you'd pass in a Boston counting house without a second glance. Only the eyes were wrong. He looked at Ashford the way Charles had looked at his breakfast, as a thing to be consumed. He's here, she said. Behind her, Isabella made a small sound. Fear, plain and undisguised. Nathaniel stepped to the window, saw the man, and his whole body went taut as a drawn bow. Charles had gone the color of ash. Places, Evelyn said quietly. You all know where. And whatever he says, nobody pays him a cent, and nobody leaves this hall until my lawyer's had his say. He wins the moment one of us blinks in the dark. So we don't blink, and we don't do it in the dark. Mrs. Abbott. She turned to the housekeeper, who'd insisted on standing witness herself. The good china, and light every lamp in the hall. Every one. I want this room bright as a courtroom. They lit the lamps. Delacroix came through the front door without knocking, hat still on, and stopped in the flood of light, and Evelyn watched him register it. The brightness, the assembled people, the housekeeper, the deeds spread on the hall table in plain view, and watched the first flicker of doubt cross his ordinary face. He'd come expecting a dark parlor and a frightened master. He'd found a lit room full of witnesses. Mr. Delacroix, Evelyn said, before he could speak, before he could set the tone, taking it from him clean. We've been expecting you. Won't you take off your hat? We stand on ceremony here. He took off his hat. Slowly. His eyes moved over the room counting, and came to rest on Isabella, and something passed between them that made the fear on Isabella's face deepen a history, an ownership, 2 years of it. Isabella, he said, you've been writing me such reassuring letters. And here I find you've been reassuring the whole household instead. His voice was mild. It was the mildness that frightened. I think you and I should speak privately. No, Isabella said. The word came out cracked, but it came out, and Evelyn saw what it cost her. Saw her step one step closer to Evelyn's side, away from the man who'd owned her death. No. Whatever's said, it's said here. In the light. I'm done writing you letters in the dark, Etienne. I'm done being your crate. You're done. He smiled, patient, terrible. You signed a paper, my dear. 2 years of silk and safety, and a name to hide behind, all against your recovery of the Hartwell estate. I have come a very long way to see it honored. You have a legal obligation. To recover an estate she legally cannot recover, Evelyn cut in. Because she is in the eyes of this state 2 years dead. Here's her certificate. She lifted it off the table. Signed by Judge Ellery of the Suffolk County Court. Miss Hartwell cannot inherit a single acre without first appearing before that same court to reverse her own death under oath in the public record, explaining precisely how a drowned woman came to spend 2 years in a Charleston townhouse leased in the name of a man named Delacroix. She set the certificate down face up in the light. Which means your claim, Mr. Delacroix, isn't a claim against Ashford at all. It's a claim against a dead woman's estate, an estate that legally does not exist, and cannot exist until you yourself walk into a Massachusetts courtroom and testify to how you hid the shipwreck survivor whose death you profited from for 2 years. She let it sit. So, by all means, let's honor the paper. Shall I send for Judge Ellery? He's an hour's ride. My lawyer's in the next room and would be glad to draw the petition. We'll undie Miss Hartwell this very afternoon in open court with you as our chief witness. How much would you like to explain, and under how much oath? The mildness left Delacroix's face. What replaced it was the thing Evelyn had been waiting for. The ugliness under the ordinary, the same ugliness she'd seen under Charles's charm, at that first breakfast, under Isabella's morning gray in the hall. The hunger with the mask off. You think you're clever, Delacroix said softly. I think I've read the paper you're relying on, and you're relying on the fact that no one else would, Evelyn said. That's not clever. That's just literate. Most of your victims, I'd guess, are too frightened to read. I'm not frightened, Mr. Delacroix. I've been ruined before. I watched my father's whole life carried out the door in crates by men exactly like you. And do you know what I learned? I learned that men like you have no power at all, except what terrified people hand you in the dark. So I've turned on the lights. And I find you're a very ordinary man, holding a very worthless piece of paper, a long way from home, in a house full of witnesses threatening a felony out loud. Evelyn. Nathaniel's voice low warning, but proud, too unmistakably proud. Delacroix's hand moved toward his coat. And every person in that hall went still, because there are men who, when the paper fails and the words fail, reach for the older argument, and for one long frozen heartbeat, nobody knew which kind of man Delacroix was. It was Charles who moved. Charles Hale, the schemer, the wastrel. The man who'd sat at Evelyn's breakfast table, trying to frighten her off her own settlement. Charles crossed the hall in 3 strides and put himself squarely between Delacroix and the women, and Evelyn saw his hands shaking and saw him plant his feet anyway. "I know you," Charles said, and his voice shook too, but it held. "Not you, your kind. I owe your kind money all over Baltimore. And I'll tell you the thing, it took me a lot of years and a lot of shame to learn, so I'll give it to you free." He swallowed. "You've got nothing here. You had one weapon, and it was fear, and my brother's wife just burned it in front of God and the housekeeper. You reach into that coat, and every soul in this room's a witness that a Charleston creditor drew on an unarmed family. You'll hang for the debt you'll never collect. So take your hat and take your worthless paper and get back in your coach, because there is not one single thing left in this house for you to take." It was, Evelyn thought later, the first genuinely decent thing she'd ever seen Charles Hale do. And it broke Delacroix, not with violence, with arithmetic. She watched him do the same sum Evelyn had done in the study. The claim was ere the witnesses were many. The courtroom would sink him. The reach for the coat would hang him, and watched him arrive at the only answer the numbers allowed. His hand came away from his coat empty. "Isabella," he said one last time, turning to her, and there was something almost human in it now, the ordinary man showing through the creditor. 2 years I housed you. You imprisoned me," Isabella said, "in silk, and called it housing, and I let you because I'd already imprisoned myself, and yours had nicer windows." She lifted her chin, and for the first time all week, she looked less like a woman playing a part, and more like a woman who'd finally stopped. "The debt's yours to chase in a court, or forget in the dark. But you'll not collect it on me, or on this house, or on any of these people. I brought you to their door. That's a sin I'll be a long time paying off. But I'll not add theirs to my account. Go home, Etienne. There's nothing here." And Delacroix, ordinary unmasked, beaten by daylight and arithmetic, and a schemer's borrowed courage, put on his hat, and turned and walked out the door he'd come through, as if he owned it, and did not own it, and never had. The coach rattled away down the drive. For a long moment, nobody in the bright hall moved or spoke. Then Mrs. Abbott, in the driest voice Evelyn had ever heard from her, said, "Shall I put the good china away now, ma'am? Or are we expecting further guests?" And something broke, and it was laughter, shaky and disbelieving and half-weeping, the laughter of people who've been holding their breath so long, they'd forgotten they were doing it. But the war was not over, and Evelyn knew it because the largest battle had never been Delacroix at all. It came that evening after the lawyer had gone with his signed and witnessed papers, after Charles had been sent to the guest wing, a changed and quieter man, after Isabella had retreated to the East Room to write one final letter to a Charleston court. This time, Evelyn had made sure of it, beginning the long, ruinous, honest work of undying herself properly and settling her own debt in the light. It came when Evelyn and Nathaniel were finally, for the first time in what felt like a year, alone. She'd gone up to their room. He'd followed. And the thing that had been building under all of it, under the deeds and the creditors and the dead woman, come home, rose up between them at last and had to be spoken. "You defended me," Nathaniel said. He was standing by the window, and he'd taken his coat off, and without it he looked younger and more uncertain and more like the man she'd glimpsed under the locked room. "In the hall, you stood in front of all of it and defended this house, this family, me, after everything. After I married you, after what you were to me at the start." "A replacement," Evelyn said. She would say the word. She'd decided a long while ago that they'd say the true words in this room or not stay in it. "That's what I was. Say it. We've come too far to flinch at it now." "A replacement." His voice was raw. "Yes. That's what I told myself you were at the start, because it was easier than admitting the truth." "And what's the truth?" He was quiet a moment. Then he crossed to her, and he did the thing he'd never once done in 9 months of marriage. He got down slowly, awkwardly. A big proud man, lowering himself onto one knee in front of his own wife, not to propose because they were already wed, but to say something that could only be said from down there. "The truth," he said, looking up at her, "is that I did not marry you to replace her. I told myself I did, because grief is simpler than shame, and it shamed me to want you." His jaw worked. "I paid your father's debts before I ever asked for your hand. Did you know that I bought up his notes quietly, the whole of them, 3 months before that ball, so that when I asked you, you'd be free to say no? I didn't want a woman who married me for a rescue. I wanted—" His voice broke. "I wanted you to be able to refuse me. And you almost did. You told me my house was too big for one man's grief, and you very nearly walked away, and it was the first time since Isabella that I felt my own heart move. And I have spent 9 months terrified of that, because loving you meant admitting I'd survived losing her, and I did not know how to survive surviving." Evelyn stood very still. "You bought my father's notes." Her voice was barely there. "That's why the creditors stopped. That spring. They just stopped. Father said it was mercy. I thought God had finally looked our way." She pressed her hand to her mouth. "It was you. All that time. It was you. I did it the way I do everything," Nathaniel said bitterly, still on his knee. "In the dark, quietly, so no one had to feel the weight of it. And I have done that to you. Our whole marriage protected you in the dark, provided in the dark, grieved in the dark, loved you in the dark, because I thought that silence was the same thing as safety. My father taught me that. A man carries it alone, he said, so the family never has to. And I carried it alone until it nearly cost me the only person I've ever chosen freely in my whole managed, arranged, dutiful life." He took her hands. "You said it in the parlor the first morning. You said you protected me from truth, but not from loneliness. I have thought about that sentence every hour since. You were right. I built you a floor no creditor could pull away, and I never once thought to simply stand on it beside you. I gave you safety, and I starved you of me. And I'm sorry. God, Evelyn, I'm so sorry." And Evelyn, who had promised herself steady hands, who had gotten through the coffin and the return and the breakfast and the creditor. Without breaking, Evelyn broke now finally, in the only room she'd ever allowed it, and it was not the breaking of a woman falling apart. It was the breaking of a dam that had held too long and was glad at last to let the water through. "You want to know what nearly killed me?" she said, tears coming freely and her voice steady through them. "It wasn't her. It wasn't the portrait or the china or being called a replacement in my own hall. It was the silence, Nathaniel. It was living beside a man who felt everything and said nothing, who loved me. I knew you loved me. I'm not a fool. I could read it in every quiet thing you did, but who would rather have carried it to his grave than say it out loud to my face?" She gripped his hands hard. "I didn't marry you for a floor. I could have found a floor somewhere. I married you because that night at the ball, I saw a man drowning in his own great house. And I thought there that one that's a heart worth the risk. And then I moved into your house, and the heart went behind a locked door, and I spent 9 months talking to the wood." "I'm opening the door," Nathaniel said. "I'm Evelyn. Look at me. I'm on my knees in it, the door's off its hinges. There's no dark left in me to hide in. Ask me anything and I'll say it out loud. Right now. In the light. Anything." "Then say the thing," she whispered. "The one thing. The one you've never once said in 9 months. Say it plain with no deed and no protection and no dark to soften it. Just say it, Nathaniel." He looked up at her. This proud, managed, dutiful man, undone at last on the floor of his own bedroom. The coffin and the creditor and the dead love all cleared away. Nothing left between them now but the truth. He'd been too afraid to speak. "I love you," Nathaniel Hale said. "Not because you healed me. Not because you stood in for anyone. Not because you're steady or clever or brave, though God knows you're all three. I love you, Evelyn Carter, the ruined merchant's daughter who told me my house was too big for my grief and was right. And I have loved you since that ball, and I buried it under a dead woman because I was a coward, and I am done being a coward. I love you. I should have said it 270 mornings ago. I'm saying it now. I'll say it every morning I have left." And Evelyn Hale sank down onto the floor with him, both of them down now, level on the same ground at last. No one standing over anyone, no one managing anyone from the shadows. And she took her husband's face in both her steady hands and said the truest thing she owned. "Then we're going to be all right," she said. "Not because the danger's past, because you finally came out into the light to stand in it with me. That's all I ever wanted. Not a floor, not protection, just a man who'd say the hard thing out loud and let me carry half of it." She pressed her forehead to his. "We'll learn the rest." But that was the wall, Nathaniel. That was the whole wall. And you just walked through it. Downstairs, the clock ticked on wound and running. The lamps burned in the hall. Isabella's pen scratched in the east room, a dead woman slowly writing herself back to life. Charles sat awake in the guest wing with the first honest thoughts of his life. And in the room that had never been hers and was from this night entirely theirs, Evelyn Hale held her husband on the floor in the lamplight and felt the last of the marble crack away from around her beating heart. And underneath it, whole and warm, and finally seen, was simply a woman who had refused to be buried and a man who had finally learned how to speak. Morning came to Ashford the way mornings do after a long fever breaks, quieter and somehow larger, as though the whole house had exhaled. Evelyn woke first. She lay a moment listening to her husband breathe beside her on her level. No wall of dark between them, and then she rose and dressed and went down to the parlor, and she did the thing she had done 270 times before and had sworn she would never do again. She looked at the empty rectangle above the mantel. The portrait was still turned to the wall where she'd left it a week ago, facing the plaster, a dead woman, looking at nothing. And Evelyn stood before it, and understood that a house could not go forward with a ghost turned to the wall any more than it could go forward with one hung in gold above the fire. Both were still the ghost ruling the room, one in honor, one in spite. Either way, still ruling. She was still standing there when Isabella came down. Isabella had changed out of the morning gray. She wore traveling clothes, now plain ones her own, not Delacroix's silk, and she carried a small case, and she stopped in the doorway when she saw Evelyn at the mantel, and the two women looked at each other across the room that had been the whole battlefield. "You're leaving," Evelyn said. "I finished the letter last night, to the Charleston court, and one to Judge Ellery here." Isabella set the case down. "I'm going to undie myself, Mrs. Hale. Properly, in the open. I'm going to walk into a courtroom and say the whole of it, the wreck, the choice Delacroix, the debt, all of it under oath in the record where it can never be used against anyone in the dark again." She almost smiled. "You taught me that. A claim built in the dark can be broken in the light. It cuts both ways, it turns out. The lie I built in the dark can only be undone in it too." "It'll ruin you," Evelyn said, not cruelly, plainly. "Every drawing room from here to Charleston. A woman who faked her death to escape her father's debts and lived 2 years on a creditor's money, they'll never let you back in." "I know." Isabella's voice was steady. "I've been dead 2 years, and I found out it's a smaller life than people think being dead. I'd rather be ruined and alive than comfortable and buried. I learned that from watching you this week, if you want the truth. You had every reason to fold the portrait the return the name I called you in this very hall, and you stood in the light and refused to be buried. I'd been telling myself for 2 years that disappearing was the brave thing, the sacrifice. And I watched you for 1 week and understood it was the coward's version of brave. The real thing is staying, and saying so, out loud." She picked the case back up. "So I'm going to go stay somewhere out loud and pay what I owe, and see what's left of me on the other side of the truth." Evelyn crossed the room. She stopped in front of the woman she'd hated for 9 months, and fought for 1 week, and understood now better than she'd ever expected to understand anyone. "I don't forgive you," Evelyn said. "I want to be honest, since we've all finally learned how. You came to take my husband and my house, and you called me a replacement in my own front hall, and I don't forgive that yet, and I may not for a long while. I wouldn't believe you if you said you did, but I understand you, Evelyn held out her hand. "And I hope the courtroom's kinder to you than the drawing rooms will be. And I hope someday in Charleston, or wherever the truth leaves you standing, you find a man who says the thing out loud. It's worth more than silk. I promise you that." Isabella looked at the offered hand a long moment. Then she took it and shook it once firmly. No performance in it, now, no soft catch of breath, no welling eyes. Just two women who had stood on opposite sides of the same fire, and both walked out of it alive. "Take care of him," Isabella said. "He was always worth taking care of. I just never learned how to do it without disappearing. You already know how. It's the difference between us. It always was." She turned to go. At the door she paused. "The portrait," she said without turning around. "Don't hang it back up. And don't leave it facing the wall either. Both of those are still letting me win." A pause. "Give it away. Or burn it. Or better paint over it. Have someone paint you Evelyn Hale right over the top of me in this house that's yours now. Let the next people who live here find a woman with steady hands looking down at the fire, and never know there was ever anyone else there at all." And then Isabella Hartwell, dead 2 years, returned, 1 week unmasked and ruined. And for the first time in the whole of the story, entirely, herself walked out the front door of Ashford Estate into the summer light, and got into the coach and rode south to undye herself properly, and was gone. Evelyn stood in the doorway and watched the coach out of sight. She did not cry. She'd done her crying in the one room where she allowed it, and she was done. But she stood there a long while feeling the strange hollow that comes after an enemy leaves the way you almost miss the shape of the fight, because the fight had made you feel every inch of your own aliveness. "She's gone." Nathaniel's voice behind her. His hand came to rest on her shoulder, not to turn her, not to manage her, just to be there warm and present in the light. "For good. For good." Evelyn covered his hand with her own. "She's going to tell the truth in a courtroom and let it ruin her. It's the bravest thing she's ever done, and it's about 10 years too late, and I think she knows that." She turned to face him. "Do you feel it, her going?" "I feel it," Nathaniel said. He was quiet a moment, looking at the empty coach drive, and Evelyn watched him say a hard thing out loud, the way he'd promised. "I loved her once, the girl I thought she was. I want to say that to you plainly in the light, because I'm done with dark rooms. I loved a girl who never quite existed, and I grieved her for 2 years, and I hung her over our fire. That was real. It happened. I won't pretend it into something smaller to make this morning easier." He turned to Evelyn. "But that's not who just left in that coach. Who just left was a frightened, clever woman I never really knew at all. And the girl I loved's been dead a lot longer than 2 years. She was dead the moment the real Isabella decided a lie was easier than a life. I just didn't find out until this week that I'd been grieving a person who was never there." His hand tightened on her shoulder. "I'm not grieving anymore, Evelyn. That's the thing I came down to say." The grief went out the door with her. "I feel it. It's gone."
Here.
Charles left 3 days later, and his going was a different thing entirely. Evelyn found him in the guest wing packing his own case badly, the way a man packs who's always had someone else to do it, and she stood in the doorway and watched him a moment before he noticed her. "You'll be wanting me gone," Charles said, not looking up. "I don't blame you. I came into this house to break it open and take my share of the pieces. A man doesn't get to do that and then stay for supper." "You stood in front of Delacroix," Evelyn said. Charles's hand stopped on the case. When his hand went to his coat, she said, "And every one of us froze. You crossed the hall and put yourself between that man and the women, shaking the whole way. And you did it anyway." She came into the room. "I've been trying to square that with the man who sat at my breakfast table telling me my marriage settlement wasn't worth the ink, and I can't. So I've decided you're 2 men, Charles, and I'd like to know which one's getting in the coach." Charles was quiet a long moment. When he spoke, it came out lower and truer than anything he'd said all week. "I've owed money my whole life," he said, "to men exactly like Delacroix. And every one of them owned a piece of me because I let them, because I was afraid and ashamed, and it was easier to keep running and keep borrowing than to stand in one place and be seen for what I'd made of myself. He set down the shirt he was holding. And then I watched your wife. I watched you turn on the lamps and read that man his own worthless paper and refuse to be afraid of him. And I thought she owes him nothing. She has nothing to fear because she's got nothing to hide. And I realized the only reason those men in Baltimore own me is that I've spent 20 years in the dark with them. Borrowing in the dark, hiding in the dark. He looked up. I stepped in front of Delacroix because for 1 minute I wanted to know what it felt like to stand in the light like you do. And it felt, his voice caught. God help me, it felt like being a man. For the first time, at 30 years old. Then be one, Nathaniel said from the doorway. Charles turned. The brothers looked at each other across the room, across a lifetime of one carrying and one running. I kept you out of the estate, Nathaniel said. You were right about that at the breakfast table. It was true, even if you said it for the wrong reasons. I told myself it was because you'd waste it, and that was true too. But it wasn't the whole truth. He came into the room. The whole truth is that Father taught me a man carries the family alone, and I carried it alone so hard and so long that I never once thought to ask whether you might have done better if I'd handed you some of the weight instead of all of the blame. I kept you a boy, Charles, so I could keep being the man who carried everything. And then I did the same thing to my wife. He put out his hand. I'm done carrying it alone, all of it. Come stand in the light, brother. There's a place for you at Ashford if you want to earn it. Not a share to break off and gamble. A place to build. In the open. Where I can see you and you can see me, and neither of us owes the dark a single thing. Charles looked at the offered hand, and Evelyn watching understood that this was the redemption she'd doubted a week ago. At her own breakfast table was possible. Not a wicked man turned good in an afternoon, but a frightened man finally offered a way out of the dark by the one person who'd never thought to offer it before. Charles took his brother's hand. I'll earn it, he said. I don't know how yet. I've never earned anything in my life, but I'll learn, the way she learned. He nodded at Evelyn. In the light. He stayed, and it was not easy, and it was not quick. A man does not unmake 20 years of running in a season, but he stayed, and he learned, and that is another story, and it is a good one, but it is not this one. The letter from Isabella came in the autumn. Evelyn read it standing in the parlor under the place above the mantel where the portrait used to hang, and now hung something else. But that comes in a moment. She read it once to herself, and then she read it aloud to Nathaniel, because they read everything aloud to each other now in the light, having sworn off dark rooms for good. Isabella had done it. She'd walked into the Charleston court and undyed herself in the open, under oath, the whole ruinous truth of it in the public record. The debt to Delacroix had been examined by a judge and found for exactly the predatory thing. It was a claim built in the dark on a hidden shipwreck, unenforceable in daylight, and Delacroix himself now under inquiry for the 2 years he'd concealed a survivor for profit. Isabella was ruined in every drawing room from Charleston to Boston, exactly as Evelyn had promised she'd be. And she had never in her life, she wrote, felt so free. I am poor now, the letter said in Isabella's own hand, plain and unperformed. I teach music to merchants' daughters, and I live in 2 rooms, and the good families cross the street to avoid me. And I sleep, Mrs. Hale. For the first time in 3 years, I sleep the whole night through, because there is nothing left in my life that I have to keep in the dark. You gave me that. You didn't mean to, and I didn't deserve it. And I'll be grateful for it until I die the second time, the real time, the one I'll meet honestly whenever it comes. Have you painted over me yet? I hope you have. I hope some stranger 50 years from now looks up at your fire and sees a woman with steady hands and never knows my name. That's the only kind of forgetting I want. Not to be turned to the wall, just to be gently finally painted over by something truer. Evelyn lowered the letter, and she looked up at the mantel where the portrait of Isabella Hartwell no longer hung, and where it was not turned to the wall, and where it had not been given away or burned. It had been painted over. Evelyn had sat for the portrait through the late summer, a local painter. no one grand, and he'd worked right over the old canvas, the way Isabella had said, layer over layer, until the dark-haired woman with the cruel, charming mouth was gone entirely under something new. And what hung above the fire at Ashford now was Evelyn Hale, steady-handed, level-eyed, painted, not in silk she didn't own, but in her own plain summer dress, looking down at the room with the calm of a woman who had refused to be buried and won. And it hung straight, perfectly, permanently straight. It did not lean 4 degrees toward anyone by morning. Evelyn had checked that first week half-braced for the old ghost to tilt it in the night. It never moved. There was no one left in the walls to pull it. "She got her wish," Evelyn said softly. "She's painted over. And she's free. And so I think are we." Nathaniel came and stood beside her, always beside her now, never behind, never managing from the shadows. He looked up at the portrait of his wife. "I have something to say," he said, "and I've been practicing it because you've taught me that the things worth saying are worth saying plain and out loud, and not saved up for some better moment that never comes." He turned to her. "I spent 2 years managing a dead woman's memory, and 9 months managing a living woman's safety. And I called both of those love, and neither of them was. Love isn't managing someone. It isn't protecting them in the dark, or providing for them in silence, or arranging their life so smoothly they never have to feel the weight of it." He took both her hands. "I know what it is now. It's this. It's 2 people standing in the same light, saying the true thing to each other's faces every day, especially the hard days, especially the days when the dark would be easier. That's the whole of it. I was 40 years learning it, and you taught me in 9 months, and I will spend the rest of my life grateful that you didn't leave before the lesson took." "I nearly did," Evelyn said. "That first morning, when you couldn't say you wouldn't look at her the way you looked at the painting. I stood in that parlor, and I'd half-packed my heart to go." "Why didn't you—" Evelyn looked up at her own steady face above the fire, and then at her husband's, and she gave him the truest answer she owned. "Because I looked at you falling apart in your own great house," she said, "and I thought the same thing I thought at that ball. There. That one. That's a heart worth the risk. I was right the first time, and I was right the second time, and I've decided I'm going to go on being right about you for the next 50 years, so you'd best keep earning it." She squeezed his hands. "And you will. That's the thing I finally believe. Not that you're perfect. That you'll keep coming out into the light even when it's hard. That's all I ever needed. Not a floor, not a rescue. A man who'll say the hard thing out loud and let me carry half. Every morning I have left," Nathaniel said. "I'll say it every morning." "Then say it now." "I love you, Evelyn Hale." He said it plain in the light, with no deed and no dark and no ghost above the fire to soften or steal it. Not a replacement, not a substitute, not the thing I built while grieving. The one thing in my whole managed, arranged, dutiful life that I chose freely and would choose again and choose every day until I die. I love you, out loud, in the light, forever. And Evelyn Hale, the ruined merchant's daughter, who had straightened a dead woman's portrait 270 mornings in a row, and then one summer stopped. Who had been called a replacement in her own front hall and refused to be one. Who had turned on every lamp in the house and read a predator his own worthless paper, and sent a dead woman south to finally live. Evelyn Hale looked up at her husband and at her own steady face, hanging straight above the fire where a ghost used to reign, and she knew with the whole of her unburied heart that the silence was over for good. "I know you do," she said. "And that's the difference. For 9 months I knew it and had to guess at it in the dark. Now I know it in the light out loud to my face. That's not a smaller love, Nathaniel. It's the only kind that was ever real." She reached up and touched the frame of her own portrait, straight and level and going nowhere. "Let it lean toward no one," she said. "Let it just be true." And it was. From that morning to the last of their long life together in that house, the portrait above the fire at Ashford Estate hung perfectly straight, and the woman in it looked down with steady hands on a family that said the hard things out loud, and carried the weight together, and never once, ever again, mistook silence for safety, or grief for love. Evelyn Carter had come to Ashford a replacement. She would leave it decades hence, and full of years, the only woman the house had ever truly belonged to, and every soul who knew her knew beyond all doubt that she had never been anyone's second choice, but the first and final truth of that man's whole life.